Okay, good afternoon or good evening to all participants. Welcome to this special lecture. We are delighted to have here today Professor Cesar Hidalgo. He directs the Center for Collective Learning at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute at the University of Toulouse. And before joining Toulouse, he directed the Collective Learning Group at MIT. Professor Hidalgo holds a PhD in physics from the University of Notre Dame, and he is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed papers and 3 books. And his latest book is How Humans Judge Machines. And that's the title of his talk. And it's really a pleasure to have him with us today. And welcome, Professor Hidalgo, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Virgilio. It's my pleasure to be here and to be again with you and with all your colleagues. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I'm going to try to do today. So there's 2 things. The first one, before I started my presentation, I just wanted to tell you we have been working, with a postdoc in my group, Mariana Macedo, who's from Brazil, in a digital participation platform focused on the Brazilian elections, in which we have proposals from all of the candidates that are running. And we're basically using this information to help understand agreements and disagreements and understand social choice theory. So I'm going to leave you the link in case you guys want to, share with students and participate. It helps us, understand people's political preferences, not over candidates, but over actual policy issues. And we've done this in France, in Chile, in Lebanon, and we wanted to use the opportunity to do this in Brazil as well. So I'll leave you the URL here in case you guys want to do that. And then I'm going to jump into my presentation, which is on How Humans Judge Machines, which is my latest book. Okay. So now here you can see my slides, and I'm going to, go into full screen mode here. Give it a second. Okay. So How Humans Judge Machines is a book that tries to answer a simple but relatively fundamental question, which is, how do humans, judge machines, when we see these machines act in certain scenarios that will have a moral dimension. And this is a question that is not about machines, it's actually more about humans, because it is us, the ones that are going to think of these machines or of the people that created these machines as good or bad, depending on the way that we judge them in these scenarios. The thing is, with the rise of artificial intelligence, there have been a lot of discussion about how people react to technology, how people interact with technology, how technology becomes part of teams and groups. But we haven't had too much work that involved counterfactuals that allow us to understand how people would judge machines compared to how they judge humans. So what we started doing around 2017, 2018 was to start collecting scenarios to run randomized control experiments. These are, experiments in which we have a population, that gets randomly assigned to a treatment or a control group. So let's say we have 200 people that get assigned to a scenario that is described as the action of a machine. And there's a different group of 200 people that get assigned to the same scenario and is presented to them as the action of a human. And we ask whether people judge humans and machines the same. If they make the same mistake, do they get the same reaction? And if they don't get the same reaction, what are the differences? What explain these differences? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you many experiments, and then we're going to be putting this data together to try to understand whether people judge humans and machines equally, and if not, what explains those differences. So the experiments involve scenarios that are situations that could be described as the action of a machine or a human. So consider an excavator that is digging up a site for a new building. Unbeknownst to the driver, the site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave and digs through it. Later, human remains are found. So this is a scenario that could have been the action of an autonomous excavator, or can have been the action of an excavator that is operated by a human. And we present people with a scenario like this, and we do a couple of data collection exercises. In one data collection exercise, we ask people to react to the scenario. We ask, was the action harmful? Would you hire this driver for a similar position? Was the action intentional? Do you like the driver? how morally wrong or right was the action, and so forth. So we asked several questions, that allow us to see how people reacted to this scenario. And remember, we are asking these questions to people that thought this scenario was the action of a human, and to people that thought this scenario was the action of a machine. And then we record those answers and we compare them using charts like this one. So going forward, red is always used to represent the data for machines, and blue is used to represent the data for humans. So for instance, here, we see that when it comes to the way in which people judge the human or the machine that dig up the grave, people tend to see the action of the machine as more harmful. They would hire the human that dig up the grave by mistake, but not so much the machine. They find the action not to be very intentional. They find it to be an accident. They like the human more. They find the action of the human to be more morally correct, and so forth. So the values here represent the average, and the bars show us the 99% confidence interval. So if these are not touching, basically we are in the presence of very low p-value. We have very statistically significant difference in this case of the order of 10 to the minus 10. Now we do a separate data collection exercise in which we assign scenarios to moral dimensions from the moral foundation theory. So the moral foundation theory tells us that when people make moral judgments, we don't just simply assign things as good or bad. We do them based on different dimensions. These dimensions involve harm. Was there physical harm that was caused in the scenario? Fairness. Was there a situation that was unjust, discriminatory, unfair, and so forth? Loyalty. Was there someone that was betrayed, or so forth? Breaches of authority, like such disobedience or disrespecting a law, or purity, things that are obscene, and so forth. And we ask people to associate words, from this list to the scenario, so we can associate them to each one of these dimensions. In the case of the machine digging up a grave, is a scenario that goes into the moral dimension of purity. Purity is the main dimension here, because basically, this is not a scenario in which there's physical harm or something particularly unfair or unloyal, but there's something sacred about the human body. We believe that a human body should not be dug up. So that purity of the human body is the one that gets triggered in this scenario. So now that we understand the methodology, let's look at a scenario that's a little bit more sophisticated. So consider this emergency response scenario. You have a tsunami that is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people. It potentially has devastating consequences, and there's a politician or algorithm that is responsible for the safety of the town. That politician or algorithm can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success, or save 50% of the town with 100% success. So this is a scenario that involves the moral dimensions of harm and fairness, because there's a physical, risk here. People can basically drown in the tsunami, but there's also a dimension of fairness, which is who do we save? There is like a choice of, who we save in one of the outcomes. Now, what we do with these scenarios, we look at three possible outcomes. So basically, we're running three separate data collection exercises. And in one outcome, we have that the politician or algorithm tries to save everyone, but fails. So we're going to call this the unlucky scenario. The town is devastating and a large number of people die. We have another case in which the politician or algorithm tries to save everyone and succeeds. And this is the lucky scenario. And finally, we have a compromise in which people try to save 50% of the town, and we know what happens. 50% of the town is saved. There's no risk. So when we look at the compromise scenario here on the right, what we find is that there are no strong differences. People see the same level of harm. They don't necessarily want to hire the machine or the human much more. They find the action of the human to be a little bit more intentional. They don't like the human or the machine more. So it's very much a tie in many dimensions. They find the action equally morally correct. So taking a compromise is evaluated equally when you're a human and machine. The only big difference here is this question in which we ask, would you replace the machine by a human or the human by a machine? So replace by the different type. And in this case, people want to replace the machine by a human, but they don't want to replace a human by a machine. So the machine that takes the compromise would get replaced. The human that takes the compromise would keep the job. Okay? But for the most part, differences tend to be quite small. Now, we like to look at the next case. When you try to save everyone and succeed, this is a positive scenario. You try to run a risk and you were lucky. And in this case, we find that the human in blue is evaluated much better than the machine. They want to hire the human more than they would hire the machine. They find the action to be much more intentional, even compared to the previous scenario. They like the human more. They find the action to be more morally correct. So even though the action is the same, here the human is getting more credit. The machine is basically taken for granted, is still evaluated positively, but not as positively as the human. Finally, we look at the unlucky scenario. This is the case in which you try to save everyone and fail. And here we see the biggest differences. People find the action of the machine as much more harmful. They want to hire the human that try and fail. They don't want to necessarily hire the machine that tried and failed. Now the action here is not seen as intentional as before. You see, before when you try and succeed, people see the action of the human as very intentional. When you try and fail, there's a relatively small difference, if you look at the p-values. And now people like the human more. People find the action of the human more morally correct. People want to promote the human, but not necessarily the machine. So we're starting to see differences. Clearly in these scenarios, people are not judging the machines and the humans similarly. And what we're starting to anticipate is that there might be different modes of judgment. Here we could say maybe there is a preference for humans, but maybe what is happening is that the human is being judged by trying to save everyone, and the machine is being judged by failing. So the human being judged, by the motivation, by the intention, and the machine being judged by the outcome. And if that is the case, if it's not just a preference for humans over machines, what we're going to be observing here is different moral philosophies, is that we're applying a moral philosophy that is consequentialist to the machine and one that is more based on intentions and motivations for the human. Now, intention is an important modifier of moral judgment. So here, consider these two scenarios. Like you have, Alice and Bob, which are two colleagues at work, that are competing for a promotion. Knowing this, knowing that Alice has a peanut butter allergy, Bob sneaks into the office kitchen, mixes some peanut butter into her soup, but at lunchtime, Alice drops her soup and she decides to go out for lunch. So she suffers no harm. So in this case, Bob tried to damage Alice, but couldn't. So there is no harm, but there is intention to harm. In the case of scenario B, you have Alice and Bob, which are two colleagues at work. It's the same situation. Now Alice has the same allergy, but Bob does not know about it and gives her a sandwich for lunch that makes her suffer a severe allergic reaction. So here, there is no intention to harm, but there is harm. And we would expect that in these cases, the situation in which Bob tries to cause, harm, even when it doesn't cause harm, should be judged worse in terms of wrongness, than the case in which, Bob doesn't try to harm Alice, but does because of an accident. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using these dimensions like harm and intention to try to map wrongness. And by the end of the presentation, we're going to be using statistics to do this mathematically, to develop functions in which we're going to be predicting the level of wrongness of a scenario as a function of the perceived intentions, as a function of the observed levels of harm, but also as a function of the characteristics of the machines and the humans involved in these scenarios. Now, let's consider another example. This is an example that involves, the generation of content for advertisement. So there is a fashion company that wants to develop a new advertising illustrating addiction to clothes. The company employs a marketing or AI marketing system to design an ad that uses the concept of addiction. The result is the picture that you observe, and a lot of people don't like that picture, so it causes outrage among some members of the public. Now, this is the real ad that was run and that was controversial. Here are another couple of examples of ad. They also trigger, reactions to this moral dimension of purity in both cases. This is an ad from a transportation group in the UK, and this is an ad from Benetton. And actually, this ad from the UK, which is quite crass, lasted only a few hours. The Ride Me All Day for £3 bus was removed, after a few hours. Now, when we look at the reactions of people to this scenario, in many dimensions, we don't find differences. People find the level of harm, or whether they, like the machine or the human, or whether it's morally right or wrong, more or less the same. But we do see here big differences in the assignment of responsibility. Who's responsible for this action? Is it the, person that created the ad, or the machine that created the ad, or is it the team that hired, the ad agency? And what we observe, when this is moving to the right here, basically it means that the responsibility is moving towards the organization, when you hire a machine. So what this is telling us is that when you are hiring a machine instead of a human to do creative jobs, and those creative jobs result in something that, is controversial, people are going to react in such a way that they're going to demand accountability by the heads of the organization. So you have now a different type of risk here in the use of AI, which is the usage of artificial intelligence implies people not going after, a technical team when something goes wrong, but going after the CEO, going after, the head of the organization when something goes wrong. And this might be another reason why organizations might be maybe unwilling to use technology, because the political risk for the senior executives is larger when technology fails, when the failure comes from a team. The next scenario involves self-driving cars. So autonomous vehicles were a hot topic. A few years ago we thought that they were going to be here sooner. Now, the self-driving car, we don't know when it's gonna be on the streets, but nevertheless, we want to understand how people react to these accidents. There are some examples, and here we have an accident that is not caused by the driver. You have a car driving on a sunny spring day. In one case is driven by a human, in another case is driverless. And this car accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. So here the pedestrian is the one that causes the accident, so it's not the vehicle's fault, it's clearly that of the pedestrian. And this is a scenario that involves the moral dimension of harm. Now, we ask people to react to this scenario, and again, we find that the machine is not judged very positively. They find the machine action to be more harmful, even though, of course, the harm is the same. It's the same accident, the same car, the same victim. They like the human driver more than they like, the machine driver. They find the action of the machine a little bit less morally correct, but there's something that is very interesting here, which is in the moral dimension of intention, which for the first time we see a flip. We see that people put more intention on the machine than on the human, not because they see the action of the machine as intentional, but because they completely excuse the human. The human gets completely, in this case, forgiven for this accident, while the machine is not forgiven completely. And we repeated this scenario with different victims. We changed the human for a dog, we changed the cause of an accident for like a tree that falls because of the wind. And in all cases, we observe the same. We find that people leave, in this case, more action in the machine than in the human. And that might sound weird. You're saying, like, what is this person talking about? A machine, having some agency or intention. So let's stop on that for a second. Can we talk about intention on machines? And the thing is that intention and agency are not something that you simply have or not. They can be thought of as part of a continuum. So imagine a self-driving car that is designed to protect drivers at all costs, or designed to protect pedestrians at all costs. In a certain situation, the car is going to have a behavior that is not going to be agency in the case of humans, but it is going to be, a behavior that is going to try to satisfy, what is intended from that car, to protect driver, to protect pedestrians, and that can have, unintended consequences. So when we think about agency, when I think that agency, is something that is progressive. On the one hand, you have a rock that has no agency. On the other extreme, you have a grown-up human that has full agency and can go to jail because of their actions, But on between, for example, you have a child, like a 3-year-old, is not morally responsible for their actions in the same way that an adult or even a teenager is. And a machine that has the ability to learn or that exhibits certain behavior is going to be somewhere in between. If that machine, for instance, can learn how to satisfy a goal, it's going to have a limited set of agency because it's not deciding what that goal is. So the goal is given and a lot of morality is on the definition of goals, not necessarily, on how you achieve them, but how you achieve the goals also, has an agency component, that could be considered. And of course, if these machines could not only decide, which goals to achieve, but how to achieve those goals, and they would learn, which goals to achieve, they would have a higher level, of agency, or they could be attributed more intention. So it's not an oxymoron to talk about intentional machines. Intention, agency are part of a continuum. And actually this has been studied by psychologists. So there's a paper by Heather Gray and co-authors in Science from, a few years ago, in which they look at how people evaluate the mental models of different entities, like, humans, like adults are perceived as entities with high agency and high experience. Experience here is the ability to feel, the ability, to feel hunger, to feel pain, to feel sadness, and so forth. Agency is the ability to act, to memorize, to plan, to decide, And in this chart, we see that machines are seen as entities that have low levels of experience. So people don't think that robots can feel, but they do think that robots have certain things that would in some way correspond to a certain level of agency, that they can plan, they can memorize, they can decide. This is particularly true for machines with the ability to learn, which are not mechanical. They're not simply responding to an algorithm. They're learning through data to develop behaviors that might try to achieve a certain goal. Now, so far, we have seen examples in which machines are not doing very well. In the self-driving car, people prefer the human to the machine. In the excavator, in the tsunami response, so far we haven't found a scenario in which machines are being judged worse than humans. So we still haven't ruled out the possibility that maybe there is just a preference for machines. So we can consider a scenario that is a little bit more complicated, that talks to several moral dimensions like loyalty, purity, and authority, and that involve a family that has a cleaner or robot in charge of cleaning their house. And this family finds that this cleaner or this robot used a national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. And what we find here is that, we can reverse, people's preference for humans in key dimensions. For example, in this case, when there is a robot or a human that use a flag to clean a bathroom floor, people report, liking the human less than they like the machine. People report finding the action of the human less morally correct than the same action done by the machine. So we're able to reverse, the judgment here in these key dimensions, showing that this is not just a simple preference for humans. We don't prefer humans no matter what. It depends on the dimensions and the scenario. And this is something that we're going to see much more in the next chapter, which talks about algorithmic bias. So the book is structured in such a way that chapter 1 and chapter 2 establish the methodology, do a review of basic concepts in ethics, moral psychology, and so forth. But chapters 3, 4, and 5 go into topics, algorithmic bias, privacy, and eventually into automation. And algorithmic fairness or algorithmic bias is an important topic because it's actually complicated. It satisfies what we know as an impossibility theorem, meaning that when we're talking about fairness, what happens is that we can define fairness in multiple ways. We can say, well, if we're giving loan to people, we can try to equalize the rate at which two different groups of people get a loan, or equalize the rate at which two different groups of people get rejected from a loan, or equalize the number of loans that we give to people from different groups. Well, all of these ways of equalizing things, all of these ways of defining fairness, each one of them could be considered in itself as a definition of fairness, but you cannot satisfy all of them simultaneously. If you satisfy one, you're going to be suboptimal in the other one. And that, makes fairness something very complicated because it's something that you can never fully achieve. If you achieve fairness according to one definition, you're going to have something that is also not fair according to another definition. Not very unfair. You can be close to fairness in multiple definitions, but not perfectly, fairness across all definitions. So in the book, we're interested on how people judge scenarios that are fair or unfair, scenarios that are seen to do something that is wrong from the fairness dimension or that is right. And these are the scenarios, for instance, that involve a human resource manager that is concerned with screening candidates for job interviews. And there is an unfair treatment in which an audit reveals that the new manager or algorithm never selects minority candidates, or a fair treatment in which the manager or algorithm makes a process that is more fair for minority candidates. Okay, so there's an unfair and a fair treatment. Now, we do have several scenarios and they provide similar results. So I'm going to just show some demonstrative results for one of them, but if you want to look at each of them, you can look at the book. So, for example, we have college admissions. Some people use algorithms in college admission systems. So to improve admissions process, a university hires a new recruiter or algorithm, that discriminates against minorities or that makes a process more fair for minorities. We have policing, we have salary increases, and so forth. But the results are very similar. And I'm going to notice a few things. The first one is that the differences, even though we observe them in some cases, are not very strong. For example, in this unfair treatment, when the algorithm or the human were caught doing something unfair, even though people judge the action of the human as much more intentional than that of the machine, they put a little bit more harm only on the action of the human. In this case, for Hispanic and African American people, not for Asian people that are discriminated. This is a United States sample. Now, they also find the action of the human to be less morally correct. So once again, here we find not a very strong effect, but we find a case in which people judge the action of the machine, a little bit more positive than the action of the human. They judge the action of the human more harshly than the action of the machine. Now, in the fair treatment, we again, find differences that are relatively small. The people put more intention, in the human action, the human that corrected unfairness, but they don't see difference on harm, and the human is not getting more credit, is not getting liked more, is not seen as doing something more morally correct, and so forth. And that's puzzling because before we saw humans getting more credit, but it was a scenario involving physical harm and emergency response. Here, humans are not getting more credit. So let's look at this in more detail. So I'm going to make 2 points. The first one is when we compare the fair and the fair treatment, we find something quite interesting, that when we look at this replaced by different question, which is, would you replace the machine by a human or a human by a machine? We find that people have a strong machine aversion. They're more likely to want to replace a machine that makes a system more fair than a human that makes a system unfair. So here we have the fair treatment, and people still want to replace the machine quite strongly, even, compared to the human that was seen doing something unfair and was attributed to do it intentionally. So even though the difference in judgments are not big, the aversion against the machine, the willingness to want to replace the machine seems to be strong. And the other thing is this fact that I've been mentioning, which is that differences are not very strong. And this is interesting because Title 7 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibit employers from discriminating employees based on demographics, race, color, national origin, and so forth. And this title from the Civil Rights Act was ratified in the US in the 1971 by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that Title 7 is protected independent of intent. Okay, and this is exactly what we find, that even though people attributed more intention to the action of the human than to the action of the machine, they don't pass on additional judgment. So that corresponds, in this case, to the law of the United States, and this is a US sample. That basically what we're saying is that when we have a situation that involves fairness, intention doesn't seem to matter. The judgment is more focused on the outcome in this case. Now, the next chapter is on privacy. I'm going to skip it because, in the interest of time, going through all of the scenarios is a little bit long. And the next chapter is that on automation. But if you're interested on privacy and automation, you can look at that on the book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put data from multiple scenarios together in these moral functions that I mentioned earlier, which are these mathematical objects that allow us to try to predict wrongness based on scenario characteristics. And I'm going to do this gradually. First, I'm going to show some descriptive statistics, how the dots fall on the maps and so forth. Then I'm going to start introducing functions by using some econometrics. So the descriptive statistics, are very straightforward. You have a diagram that has harm, intention, and wrongness, and each scenario is represented by 2 dots. The way that you judge a human, the way that you judge a machine, and we connect these 2 dots with a line so we know which judgments corresponds to which across the scenarios. And when we put all of this together, we get this beautiful, 3D chart in which all of the scenarios that involve these 3 dimensions are represented. Now, you see that all of the points fall across kind of like a plane in the middle, like along the diagonal. And the reason for that is simple, is that they're forbidden corners, yes? If there's a scenario that has a lot of harm and a lot of intention, nobody says that is not wrong, And if there's something that has no harm and no intention, nobody thinks that is wrong either. So there's some constraints, but other than that, we see that the blue dots and the red dots are not on top of each other. There are differences across these scenarios, across all dimensions. So if we look at this cube from the top, and we look at the harm intention plane, we find something quite interesting. We find that the way that people judge humans is with either a lot of intention or with very little intention. So it's a very bimodal distribution, So when we're judging the intentions of humans, basically we think that people do things with some motivation, or it's a complete accident and we can forgive them. There's, like full forgiveness for the human compared to a machine. But when we judge the intentions of machines, we don't assign a lot of agency or intention, but, also we're not willing to forgive them as much. So we have these 2 different modes of judgment, a bimodal for the humans and a unimodal for the machines. Now, when we look at the intention wrongness plane, following what we have said earlier, we know that intention amplifies judgment. So if there's no intention, things cannot be very bad or very good, and as intention grows, things can be very bad or very good, and at these high levels of intention, intention correlates a lot with the judgment. But at low levels of intention here, we find that the actions of the machines are perceived much worse than the actions of the humans. So here is in this corner that machines are not getting a break. And finally, we look at harm and wrongness. We find a strong correlation between harm and wrongness. So people find, scenarios that include more harm to involve, a worse judgment. But when harm is low, even when the level of harm perceived is the same, you see that vertical lines here across many of these scenarios, people judge the actions of the machines as worse. They are judged worse in the wrongness scale. So now that we have looked at the descriptive statistics, we're going to do some modeling. The modeling is going to involve fitting a function in which we predict the level of wrongness as a function of intention and harm. And we're going to do this function for scenarios that were presented to people as the action of humans, scenarios presented to people as the action of the machines. And we're going to fit a function of this form in which you have a harm term, an intention term, an interaction term with intention and harm, and we have fixed effects. These fixed effects, what they do is they help us control for all of the characteristics of the subject. So if there's some subjects that are more judgy, or some subjects, that are different in terms of their demographics, for example, men and women, or people with higher or lower level of education, for example, the fixed effects take account all of the individual level variation, and therefore, we can get variation that is variation of people's perception of the scenarios. So in the book, you can see the full function with all of the coefficients, but here I just show you the result. We plot these functions, in 3D, and what we find is quite interesting. We find that these functions are not parallel. Here in red, we have the function that shows the way that people judge machines on average, and in blue, we have the way in which people judge humans on average. And if the only thing that was going on was that people like humans and dislike machines, well, the planes would be parallel and people will find the actions of the human a little bit better, so the blue plane would be below the red plane. But that's not what we observed. We observed that the red plane is quite flat, and the blue plane has kind of a curvature, so it's the same as the red plane here, but here in the back, there's a big gap, a gap of about 0.2 points in the scale, which is huge gap, and that's for the scenarios that have little intention and a lot of harm. So what we have is that when people are judging machines, in the red plane, The only thing that seems to matter, or what matters the most, is the perceived level of harm. Is this dimension where the slope is? So it's a very consequentialist philosophy. But when we judge humans, we judge them along this diagonal. So it's about the interaction between intention and harm. So when we're judging humans, we're saying, was there harm? And was the person trying to cause harm? And if the answer is yes to both, to that and, then we judge the scenario as bad. But if there is harm, and there was no intention, we tend to forgive the human. Not completely, yes, there's still, if there is harm, there is some damage, and there is a slope on the harm dimension, but it's a slope that is much smaller here than here. You see here, the slope goes, it's a big triangle, here is a little triangle, in comparison. So we have these different modes of judgment. Finally, we do the opposite. We do a scenario fixed effects. We're going to fix the judgment of the scenarios, and we're going to look at the demographic characteristics of people. We're going to look at, well, do people that reported, self-reported as males or females in our sample, do they judge things differently? Do people, that self-report as religious or not, judge things differently or not? So we look at how much, the demographic characteristics, change the judgments. And there's two things that I want to mention. The first one, and I know this is a sensitive issue, so this is important to mention, is that the size effects, even though they're significant, are very small. So if you look at the scale here, you see that this effect is 0.05, okay? The effect that I had shown you in the previous chart is 0.2, okay? So that's like almost 10 times larger. That's, like almost an order of magnitude larger. So these effects are significant, but they're not dominant. So what this means is that, what drives the judgment is what's going on in the scenario. It's not who is judging the scenario, okay? So, the difference of who is judging are significant. We can measure them, but they're not dominant. They're second order. They're a harmonic in a music scale. Yeah, they're not the main, tone. Now, what do we find? For instance, when we ask people, would you replace a human by a machine or a machine for a human? And we compare the answers of males and females. What we find is that, males are much more likely to want to replace a human by a machine, and women are much more likely to want to replace a machine by a human. So to put it in simple terms, we can say that men are more machinophilic. Men like machine more and women like humans more, and that's the effect. It's not a strong effect, but it's a very significant effect in this case. When we look at education, we see an effect in the same direction, okay? So as people become more educated, if we compare people with high school degrees, with grad school degrees or college degrees, people that are more educated tend to be a little bit more machinophilic, And when we look at religion, for instance, people that self-report as religious, we ask yes or no. We don't ask which religion. We just, do you consider yourself religious? Yes or no. People that are religious tend to be a little bit more human-philic, a little bit more machinophobic, we can say. So there are also demographic differences. They are significant, but of course they're not as strong, they're not dominant. And the reason for that, I think, is quite obvious when you think about it, that if I have a scenario in which a robot pulls out a gun and kills someone, and I have a scenario in which a robot pulls out a flower and gives it to someone, no matter who you are, the scenario in which the robot pulls out a gun and kills someone is worse than the scenario in which the robot pulls out a flower and gives it to someone. The difference in the scenarios are big. The differences between people's, preferences and perceptions are going to be second order to the differences that we can create across the scenarios. So we started this presentation by asking, well, if a machine and a human make the same mistake, do they get the same reaction? Hopefully by now I convince you that they don't. They get a very different reaction. So the question then is why? Why do people judge humans and machines differently? We know that it's not a preference, there are these different modes. So what we did is we ran a separate set of experiments. This is now not part of the book. This is a paper that we're now submitting to a journal. And we asked people, well, we try to understand if people would judge human-like robots more similar to the way that they judge humans. Okay, so for example, you see here the robot on the left is a robot, that is helping build a wall, but it's not very human-like. Yes, this is a robot, that looks, very much like a machine. While on the right, you have a robot that has, beautiful eyes, has kind of like an expression on their face. Even though it looks very mechanical, it has, that human-like component. So to do this, what we had to do is we had to expand the experimental methodology. Instead of having one machine condition, we had 4 machine conditions. And these 4 machine conditions allowed us to move machines in this agency and experience plane. So remember I showed you this paper, from Gray et al., in which machines, were considered to have low experience and intermediate level of agency. Well, we created scenarios in which we tried to manipulate people's perception of agency and experience. So basically, we give people a description of a machine that is different depending on the experimental condition in which they're in. So we tell them that, for example, for the human condition, Alice is a 40-year-old woman working multiple jobs, because we are showing a lot of diverse scenarios. So it's to indicate that you can have experience in many different things. But for the machine condition, we say Alice is an advanced robot able to plan. Or other people get Alice is a robot that is unable to plan, or we have some scientists believe that given Alice advanced artificial intelligence, she is able to feel anger or pain, or unable to feel anger or pain. So we just manipulate with a very simple text. We just change these words here and there, but still, when we check at the manipulation, in the experiment, we're able to get people to evaluate, the different robots differently, right? And significantly so. So we have a high agency, high experience condition, high agency, low experience condition, low agency, high experience, and low agency, low experience condition. So we have 4 machines that are perceived differently, and people are going to evaluate now these 4 machines. Now, remember, randomizing, we're separating people in this case into 5 different universes. And remember our modal functions? Well, all of a sudden they became a little bit more complicated, because now we're going to have a modal function that includes perception of agency and experience. And there's one technical point that I need to make here, which is the following, is that before I was showing you some charts and I was saying, look, people care about harm when we judge, machines, or they care about intention when we judge humans. Well, to do that formally, what we need to look is at the derivative of, let's say, wrongness on harm or wrongness on intention. And that is not just looking at these coefficients because of this interaction term. Because of this interaction term, the derivative of wrongness on harm, actually is a little bit more complicated. It has the coefficient of harm, but also the interaction between, intention and the coefficient of the interaction term, and the same in the opposite direction. It's a symmetric function. So now we have a bigger function, that, basically we have harm times agency, harm times experience, intention, but we can group this function into these larger, coefficients now that go into the same intention, harm, and interaction term between intention and harm. Perfect. So we get into the same. Now we just need to estimate a larger model across all of these conditions, but it's more or less straightforward. So now, when we do this, when we estimate the model, we find that not everything is significant. So the intention coefficient is significant, the harm coefficient is significant, but for example, the agency times harm coefficient is significant, but not the agency times intention coefficient. This one, is not robustly significant. So we want it significant, with the fixed effects, in both cases. The agency and intention times harm coefficient is significant. So we take only the significant coefficients to look at our models, and we obtain these modal functions. To keep it short, I'm just going to go to the chart. So the first question that we were asking is, well, how does the wrong of harm on wrongness change, when we change now the agency of machines, And what we find here is that for the median level of intention, people, put less effect of harm on wrongness in the high agency condition. Okay, so when agency is high, people tend to forgive machines in scenarios that have no intention compared to the low agency condition. So now we're starting to get that curvature. We're starting to get that interaction term that we didn't have before. Now when we look at the role of intention, on wrongness, what we find is that when, now you have the interaction term with harm, this is the middle level of harm, and we find that in this case, no matter the level of harm, people now put the role of intention on harm, on wrongness becomes larger for the high agency condition. So for the high agency condition, this derivative is larger than for the low agency condition. So when we put this together in the charts that we have found before, we found that basically when we're in the low agency condition, we're in something more similar to the previous case, yeah. And in the high agency condition, these two planes are becoming much more similar. They're becoming almost parallel to each other. And we can measure the volume between them. And actually, the volume is much larger for the low agency condition than for the high agency condition. So we show, that when you increase the agency perception of machines, people start switching the moral judgment. So it's not that we judge humans and machines differently, it's that we judge entities based on perceived mental models. One way to describe these mental models is agency and experience. And as this mental model of the machine becomes closer to the mental model that we have for humans, we use a similar moral judgment algorithm. So how do we judge machines? Well, people judge humans by intentions and machines by their outcomes. That's the simple way of talking about our main results. You now know that it's a little bit more complicated. There's an interaction term and there's all of that. But if you want to talk to like your friends at a barbecue and everything, this is probably something, to keep it simple, and keep the conversation going. Now we also learned that people judge human intentions bimodally. We either care about these intentions a lot or we forgive people. Machine intentions more unimodally. People are also more forgiving of humans in accidental situations, and that's a corollary of these two, that actually can be deduced from those two. People are a bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, like algorithmic bias, labor displacement. I didn't show the labor displacement. You can see in the book. That's a set of cases in which we find people prefer, a machine than a foreigner, in many cases. People find more harm in violent scenarios involving machines. We show some examples of that, the self-driving car or the emergency response scenarios involve physical harm, but in the appendix of the book, we have scenarios involving extrajudicial killings, and people judge machines very harshly. So where there's physical harm involved, their machines are judged much more harshly than humans. And we saw cases in which people can take machine success for granted and give more credit to the person, like in the emergency response scenario. But why do people judge humans and machines differently? Well, this difference in moral philosophy seems to be part of a continuum. Machines that are perceived closer to humans based on mental models of perceived agency and experience tend to be judged more similarly to the way that we judge humans. And this suggests that our judgments of machines is a particular example of a continuum of modes of judgment that can be extended beyond human and machines. So the book is available in print. It's also available as a set of 30 YouTube videos. So if you teach online or you want material for your students to watch, and then discuss in class, it's a little bit abridged. It's not exactly all of the material in the book, but it's quite close. It's like 30 episodes of about 7 minutes each that we produced during the pandemic, and it's also available for free. You can get the digital edition at judgingmachines.com. So if you want to buy the book from MIT Press, that's great. It's a very nice and beautiful print. But also, if you just want to get the PDF, for mobile or for desktop, you can get it. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time. And I would be happy to open up the floor for discussion.
Well, thank you, Cesar, for your wonderful lecture. It's quite
Thank you so much, Cesar.
Some questions from the audience. I was going to ask you a first question about that short phrase that summarized the results that humans are evaluated by intention and machines by outcomes. Do they apply to different countries? Because we know that moral values they vary according to the culture of the countries. So you think that this is a statement that applies to a country or to different countries, considering that you did your experience in the US?
So there's two parts to our question. So there is, of course, like a cautious part, which you say, like, you will need to run this empirically and figure it out. but the book and the research that we have, tell us something about the hierarchy of effects between scenarios and between demographic characteristics, And what we find is that these differences between people's perceptions tend to be relatively small compared to differences between the scenarios, and a scenario in which a robot kills someone or gives a flower, as I said before, as an example, is a huge difference. And my intuition would be that these different modes of judgment are not because of culture. Culture is gonna modify these planes a little bit. It might move them, but it's not gonna change that larger effect. So if I were to have to bet money on the potential result of a worldwide experiment in which this would be run across multiple countries, in a blind setup, I would bet my money in which that would remain and that the differences would be second order.
Well, thank you. I have another question here. What would be a satisfactory for the public in terms of reward or punishment for high agency machines which do good or wrong? So what would be satisfactory for the public in terms of reward or punishment?
Yeah. So it's hard because when it comes to the reward or punishment that we would think of a machine right now, it's in a legal context on what we would call a form of vicarious responsibility or liability, that the machine in itself doesn't have responsibility, but those that create them, have the responsibility. So this is a concept, for instance, that applies to like a person that owns a dog. When you own a dog and the dog bites someone, like you're responsible for that. So in that context, there is, a context of vicarious responsibility that you need to consider, and therefore the responsibility gets transferred to the organization. Now, to whom it gets transferred and when and why, that is complicated because there are other concepts, that are more difficult to understand in the concept of machines that involve product liability law. One of these, concepts is the fact that when you have a product, and we can think that AI is a product like GPT-3, DALL-E 2, they're products, like they're very scalable and distributed. A manufacturer responsible for a product only as long as that product is used in the way that it was intended. So if you jump out of an airplane with an umbrella and you kill yourself, you cannot sue the umbrella company because the parachute was not good, but with an AI, the intended uses are harder to foresee, and they might evolve over time. So on the one hand, that idea of intended uses can be complicated, can lead to, I'm sure that in these cases, like lawyers can become very creative about, what are the limits or not of the intended uses if they would have to defend a case. And the other one is differential, liability, which is, well, if there's an AI and the AI, it's the result of algorithms, data, hardware, usage, and so forth. Well, how much of that liability gets assigned to each one of who caused the mistake, And for example, in this algorithmic bias, there's a lot of discussion of how much comes from the data, how much comes from the algorithm, and how you assign it differentially, And without a way to assign differential liability is very hard then to move forward in those cases of responsibility. So I wouldn't have an answer on how to do it, but I would say that these three concepts, the vicarious liability, the differential liability, and intended uses are three things that would need to be part of that legal discussion.
See that your book and your lecture was quite interesting for public policymakers. Let me give you an example. Consider that a country is observing an automation initiative. So one question is, what defines the place for automation? What defines the place for machines that will automate some type of job or work? Usually, people look at cost, basically only at cost. cost of replacing humans. But I think that your work gives three interesting factors that are harm, intention, and wrongness to evaluate, maybe to help to formulate some public policies for automation. And we know that many countries are trying to come up with regulation for not only for AI, but also for machines that automate services.
Yeah, so I agree, and I've read and participated a little bit of that conversation. I'm a little bit concerned, because I do agree that there's a big demand, for AI regulation. Like, in some sense, a lot of the demand for regulation usually comes from, emotions, from fear. Like people, might be concerned about this technology. They want to be protected. The role of the state is to protect its population and so forth. But that doesn't mean that we would know what we're doing when we're doing it. So for instance, like here in the EU, there has been this proposed AI regulation and so forth that in a way, when you take it at heart, when you read the regulation, it might be interpreted as a regulation against the use of math and algorithms, because what counts as an AI? It's an AI only like a neural network, or it's a regression algorithm, a logistic regression, some form of AI. Sure, you learn some coefficients, and when you're learning machine learning, you start with, like linear regression or logistic regression. Now, people have been using logistic regression in the insurance sector for, decades, and now are they also now subject to the AI regulation because any statistical method is subject to that, and that boundary, for instance, is very unclear. The legal speak is unable to clarify it, and it might mean that we kind of like make a regulation that overshoots, like its scope, simply because it bleeds from AI to any use of algorithm or maths in decision making, which I think would be dangerous. We do want to have formulas and math and in decision making. So to me, that's one of the things that concerns me, is that I do understand that there's a big demand for regulating AI. People want it. Politicians want to make a name for themselves doing it. Do we know what we're doing? I don't think so. I think the fact that this talk is based on a book that is relatively new and is telling us how we compare machines and humans, and that's new, it means that we're very early on the journey, of knowing how to regulate this.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I have a question here from someone from a medical school, and he asks the following: do context modify judgments, the context of the application? And he says, for example, in AI in healthcare, the AI could be judged differently according to the kind of decision it makes. So the question that he asks
Absolutely,
is about,
yes,
the importance of the context for the judgment.
And by looking at the scenarios, we have 89 scenarios. What we're trying to do is to look at that context. But of course, context, it's almost infinite. You can always imagine, other cases. So I have a big belief that like morality is incomplete, like in the Gödel sense, that you always can find another example in which whatever rules you've done, are not going to be able to deductively help you reach a certain conclusion, or a proper judgment. So context matters. And in the case of healthcare, there's a lot of aspects of context that are well known. Like there's a lot of people that have worked on ethics in biomedical, research and practice. So the autonomy of the patient, do they have the ability to decide for themselves or not? Has that been violated? Like there's many principles that will need to be considered. And there are some papers that I was in a conference in Paris not so long ago, where people have been doing very similar experiments using particular examples only for the medical field. Yeah.
Okay, I have someone that wants to ask you a question. Ellen, I think that she wants to ask a question about ethics. It's up to you, Ellen.
So
Okay.
the question is, you are worried, you are concerned about the context of how information changes the context and change the values of things. I remember that you were saying about this very expensive car, and the car is, it has the same value as gold. And then suddenly you are talking about how humans judge machines, and it's like things change because of the context. And so the main question is how you see the politics behind it, because the governance thing is like, as you said, the governance can be too hard and too tied to a certain context, as it was like one solution would be good for all, and it doesn't work like that. So how do you see the politics behind it in a way, because the ethics has to do with politics? And so how you see in the way people are creating machines and creating experiments and changing things. And what I see is like, I'm making these maybe more complex question is because I'm developing a concept about bioethics of non-presence, which I like to think ethics with all the information that is flowing, and we don't consider all this information when we are talking about doing things ethically.
Okay, it's a little bit complicated, but like how do I consider the politics of the governance of the evolution of information, the use of information, of artificial intelligence? Can you help me a little bit?
Ellen. Yeah, the politics behind what I mean is because when you think about context and culture, at the end of the day, you were talking about how people judge. As Virgilio just asked you, it might change if people change from one room to another. From one room, no, from one country to another, from one culture to another. So there is always politics behind, and the way people make decisions. They choose what to do best and what not to do best, or what is wrong, what is right and wrong. So
yes. Okay. So like I wouldn't have too much to say there, but like what I could add is that I think, you know, many of these issues that we have right now are issues that are not part of the traditional spectrum of, you know, political choices, you know. So if we look at the elections in this year in France, in Chile, or in Brazil, you know, there's not too much about artificial intelligence or digital technology in the programs of the candidates, in the discussions, and I think we might find people in different parts of the current traditional spectrum in different positions, you know. So in that context, I would make two predictions. One is that if, you know, artificial intelligence, digital technologies continue to become more important and in the labor market, continue to become more important in people's lives and so forth, maybe there's going to be a politics that is going to emerge that is going to make that the issue. You know, like politics usually tend to pick issues that they're predominant for them. So you have, for example, identity politics that cares a lot about how people identify themselves in terms of their sexual preference, demographic characteristics. There's other people that do politics based on economic opportunities and liberty, and they attract a certain set of voters. I don't see people that are doing politics right now based on how they position themselves with respect to digital technology. But I would say there might be a future in which, if people's position with respect to digital technology, it's, you know, an important, you know, political issue for them, enough to be more important than, let's say, traditional economic freedoms or identity or other things, there might be an emergence of parties and politicians that move in that direction. And my prediction would be that, again, people will get polarized around those ideas. It's always like the outcome usually when something becomes more prominent, more popular, more discussed, is that there tends to be a polarization as a result. So the way that people judge machines is something that I think we're all willing to talk about right now, but maybe in a few years from now, maybe in 10, 20 years from now, it's going to be something that is going to be more common, and it's going to be a source of division and confrontation.
Cesar, we have two more questions so that we and then we finish that. One is from Paola. Is she there? I think so. And the other one is from Demi. Hi, Paola.
Thanks for the lecture.
Thank you.
Você mencionou alguns conceitos morais como mal, justiça.
You mentioned some moral concepts such as purity, intention, but you mentioned yourself that the concept of justice depends on definition. And also, we have some concepts that are not in the West.
Você leva em consideração para esses conceitos que você escolheu, de conceitos morais, mal, justiça, lealdade, autoridade, pureza, alguma regulamentação principiológica específica? Você se baseou, você se fundamentou em algum guideline ético específico? Então,
okay.
Questão... Pois não.
See, I'm able to understand. I'm not able to speak Portuguese, but I was able to understand. So the choice of the moral foundation theory, like these 5 dimensions, is because it's an important theory on the psychology of morality. So it's not a theory that comes from ethics, but comes from psychology. And as people are trying to understand the way in which we make moral judgments, they understood that we make them across these different dimensions, and the way that people value these dimensions differently. For instance, Jonathan Haidt has proposed that it affects, people's political views and preferences, and even how to get messages to them. So people that care a lot about loyalty and authority might receive messages very different than people that care about harm and fairness. So if you want to market to the left, you talk about harm, you talk about fairness, you talk about victims, you talk about people suffering in hands of the power. If you want to talk about to the right, you talk about order and structure, because people value things differently in these different groups. And this psychological theory is helping us understand, that it's not that there's good and bad people, it's that there's people that have different points of view. And, you can understand where these different points of view are coming from, and even you can understand quite a lot of like the heterogeneity of the world by having this perspective. So I decided to go with the moral foundation theory because it's a powerful psychological framework, and the book at the end of the day, it's about psychology. It's about how we perceive the machines. It's at the end, all of the action is happening on the humans. It is us, the ones that are judging the machines. It's not that the machines are this way or that way. It is our perception of them. So that's why we build more in psychology than let's say in a legal or ethical framework. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be research that could be done from that perspective as well. And I've seen people that take ethical principles and frameworks, and they also run experiments to try to see their effect on the way that people judge machines. So it's not incompatible. It's just that you have to start somewhere, and this was a good place to start for us.
And Cesar, we have one more question, and then we let you go. I know that it's late for you. It's almost 11 o'clock. The question is going to be asked by Demi. He is the director of the Internet governance body in Brazil, and he's also a professor.
Thank you.
Yeah, Demi, please.
Sorry. I will try to make a question on live. I like it very much your comment about Gödel and the incompletude thing, how the ethics is in some way incomplete. If you can say a little bit more about that. And also, I agree with you that regulation is very premature now. We have to be much more advanced in the field before to begin thinking in regulation. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Demi. Yeah, so like this idea that morality is incomplete, I think is a profound idea, because on the one hand, we know now for almost a century that mathematics is incomplete. Yeah, what that means is that for the people that are not familiar with the concept, is that there are logical truths that cannot be proven within the axioms of a logical system without expanding that set of axioms. And if you expand the set of axioms, you get truths that go beyond, the ones that you have now. When it comes to morality, morality is interesting because morality is inherently social. In a universe that there would be only one single entity, that entity, in some sense, would be alone with their thoughts, and there's no good or bad. But once you have people in a social context, you can start having moral contradictions, and that's why fictional literature is so interesting. Like, literature is built around those moral contradictions and tensions, and that's something, for instance, that Asimov, who is one of the great thinkers on this space, used to exploit. So there is this story that Asimov has called Liar, in which you have a robot, that had this brain that was able to read minds, okay? And there's all of these scientists and everything say like, wow, we don't know how it happened, but there is a robot in this other room that knows how to read minds. And they all go and talk to the robot, and they take turns, So first, there's this guy that goes and talks to a robot, and was a guy that was, ambitious and wanted to take the job of the other guy. And the robot says, of course, you're going to take the job, and yada, yada. And the guy goes very happy. And then, there's this woman that goes and she was in love with this other guy, and the robot goes and say, of course he loves you, but he just doesn't tell you. And the woman leaves very happy, and they all go there, and then, they have this interview with the robot, and when they get together, they start talking about what the robot told them, and the robot, had told everybody lies, because the robot could read minds, so it could tell people what they wanted to hear. And they could tell people what they wanted to hear because the robot thought that he was satisfying this principle from Asimov's laws that they couldn't do harm. So, okay, if I tell you what you want to hear, I don't do harm, because if I tell you something that you might not like, I'm harming you. But the harm kind of like was delayed, came later, because when people realized that that was a lie, they were hurt. So then the robot, reaches that contradiction that in some sense, you cannot, if you're trying to satisfy this principle of not doing harm, when you have a society who has multiple people, you have to choose if the harm is now or later. But you cannot not have it when you have a misexpectation between what the person wants to hear, and what the truth is, and that to me is where the incompleteness, gets really complicated in society as we start adding people and the system become more complex. You're not going to have a universal truth that is always going to work and satisfy everyone's, feelings. Feelings are complicated. There is that. The other part where I do think things also renormalize in terms of complexity is in this idea of agency, in which some people define intelligence as the ability to satisfy a goal. Like people like Stuart Russell and others at Berkeley say, okay, it's the ability to satisfy a goal. No, but satisfying a goal can be very immoral, because you can have a very bad goal given to you, that you satisfy, So then, well, there is a higher morality or a higher intelligence that would involve knowing which goal to satisfy. But choosing which goal to satisfy can also be thought of as something that exists in the context of a larger goal. Yeah. So, okay, but why am I satisfying this goal, or why to choose this goal? That is going to be in the context satisfying another goal. So it's like Russian dolls, you satisfy a goal, but then when you choose which goal to satisfy is in the context of a larger goal. And as you expand in the goals, you kind of like start having now the burden of trying to take into account everyone and everything, and it becomes really complicated. It becomes kind of like the God problem, as you you can try to optimize for you, for your family, for your friends, but as it grows and grows, it becomes more complicated. So I do think that is kind of like a problem of complexity that is social, but also is in this nestedness of goals that are defined and goals that need to be satisfied.
Thank you, Demi, for the question, and
Good question.
Cesar, for this wonderful presentation and your final story, Asimov story about the complex of our contemporary society. Thank you. I think that was a great talk for all of us, and I hope to see you.
Looking forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Hope that you can come and visit us in Brazil soon. Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, Virgilio. Bye, Demi. Bye, Ellen. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Ciao.